What if I told you that the most powerful message you could ever deliver is the one where you say nothing at all, not the perfect response, not the final confrontation, not the emotional farewell, but complete silence? And for someone who depends on control, that silence can become the one thing they cannot influence or reshape. Today, we are going to explore what truly happens inside the mind of a narcissist when you emotionally disappear and stop reaching out completely. Some of the things they begin to recognize may shock you, and some of the most important transformations do not happen within you, they happen within them. Before we begin, I want you to reflect on something. Have you ever spent countless hours thinking about whether you should send one more message, give one final explanation, or offer one last opportunity for them to understand the pain they caused you? If that thought has ever kept you awake, stay with me, because by the end of this discussion, you will understand why your silence may have communicated everything they needed to know, and why it may have been the first moment you truly took back your personal power. One of the most common misunderstandings people have about relationships with narcissistic individuals is the belief that silence is simply a lack of communication. But in reality, silence can become one of the most psychologically powerful moments in the entire relationship because it interrupts a pattern the narcissist has become familiar with. For a long period of time, the relationship may have followed a predictable cycle. There may have been moments of affection followed by criticism, uncertainty, emotional distance, or disagreements. You may have responded by explaining yourself repeatedly, defending your intentions, apologizing even when you were not responsible, or desperately attempting to bring peace back into the relationship. Every one of those reactions provided the narcissist with important information. They learned what affected you emotionally, what kept you attached, and how much energy you were willing to invest in trying to repair the connection. Whether the interaction was positive or negative often mattered less than the fact that you continued to participate. Your emotional availability allowed the cycle to continue, but when you suddenly stop reaching out, something essential begins to shift. The familiar emotional exchange disappears, the messages stop coming, the explanations end. The constant attempts to be understood finally come to a halt. From your side, this silence may feel like a way of protecting yourself and creating emotional distance. But from the narcissist's point of view, it can represent the breakdown of a system they had become comfortable with. They no longer receive the reassurance that they can affect your emotions whenever they want. Even if they never openly acknowledge it, they are forced to face something they often struggle with deeply: uncertainty. They no longer know what is happening inside your mind. They cannot tell if you are hurt, angry, ignoring them, healing, or simply continuing your life without them. This lack of knowledge can feel extremely uncomfortable because control often depends on knowing what to expect. When someone becomes emotionally unavailable, the usual strategies used to pull them back into the same pattern become much less effective. This does not automatically mean the narcissist suddenly experiences deep regret, genuine accountability, or complete emotional understanding. It is important to recognize the difference between losing emotional access and losing real love. Many people believe that silence immediately makes a narcissist realize how deeply they care about someone. But relationships involving strong narcissistic patterns often focus more on maintaining influence than creating balanced emotional intimacy. What they often notice first is not simply that the person is gone, but that their access has disappeared. The familiar source of attention, emotional reactions, reassurance, and validation is no longer responding in the way they expected. That sudden change can create frustration, curiosity, confusion, or even a sense of urgency because the pattern they depended on has been interrupted. This is why silence can sometimes have a stronger psychological effect than endless arguments or carefully prepared explanations. Arguments still create emotional connection. Every reaction proves that the relationship still holds space in your emotional world. Every response shows that they can still reach you, but silence removes that confirmation. It provides no predictable response, no emotional energy to draw from, and no clear indication of whether their influence remains. In many situations, that absence communicates something far more powerful than words ever could because it reveals a truth that explanations often fail to express. The cycle is no longer continuing. The emotional pattern has been broken. One of the most painful realities to accept after leaving a relationship with narcissistic dynamics is realizing that what felt like love to you may have represented something completely different to the other person. Healthy relationships are built on mutual respect, emotional security, compassion, and a sincere desire for both individuals to grow together. However, relationships involving strong narcissistic behaviors can often become centered around influence, validation, and control. This does not mean that every person with narcissistic traits is incapable of emotions, and it does not mean they never experience attachment. However, their attachment may often be connected to maintaining their position, their importance, or their ability to influence the relationship, rather than creating an equal emotional bond. This difference is extremely important because it changes how we understand their behavior after you stop contacting them. When communication suddenly ends, many people hope the narcissist will finally recognize their worth, understand their mistakes, and feel deep regret for everything that happened. While moments of regret can happen, what often captures their attention first is the realization that they are no longer controlling the emotional direction of the relationship. Throughout the relationship, they may have become used to deciding when conversations happened, when affection was shown, when tension appeared, and when reconciliation would take place. They may have been comfortable with setting the emotional pace and knowing how you would respond, but when you remove yourself from that pattern, the dynamic begins to change. The control they once felt starts to weaken, and the silence becomes a reflection that they can no longer ignore. They may have believed that after every conflict or disagreement, you would eventually come back, try to explain your side, offer an apology, or seek some form of reassurance from them. This expectation can create a strong sense of psychological security for them. They assume that the relationship will always continue to revolve around their decisions, their timing, and their actions, because that is the pattern they have become accustomed to. But when you stop reaching out completely, that certainty begins to disappear. Suddenly, they are no longer the person controlling when communication happens or when the connection resumes. Instead, they are faced with the realization that someone else has stepped away from the dynamic they once believed they could influence. For someone who depends heavily on having an impact over another person's emotions and choices, this sudden shift can feel much more meaningful than they expected. They may begin questioning why their usual approaches no longer seem to create the same reactions they once received. When they send a message and there is no response, or when they attempt to trigger an emotional reaction and nothing changes, they lose an important form of reassurance. They no longer have the same confirmation that they can influence your thoughts, decisions, or feelings whenever they choose. This is one reason why some individuals with narcissistic patterns may begin displaying noticeably different behaviors once your silence continues. At one moment, they may appear caring, charming, and regretful, expressing affection, remembering old memories, or acting as though they deeply miss the connection. Then, at another moment, their behavior may shift completely, becoming cold, judgmental, dismissive, or openly frustrated. They may try to create jealousy, gather information about you through shared connections, or behave as if they have already moved forward and are completely unaffected by your absence. These changes can feel extremely confusing because the behaviors seem opposite and emotionally inconsistent. One day they appear to want closeness, while another day they act as though they do not care at all. However, beneath these different reactions, there can often be a similar underlying motivation, discovering whether they still have access to your attention and whether they can still influence your emotional state. The exact method they use may change, but the deeper desire is often connected to regaining a sense of power or importance that was interrupted when you stopped participating in the old pattern. Recognizing this difference explains why repeated conversations and endless attempts to make them understand your feelings often fail to create meaningful transformation. If the main goal is to maintain influence rather than develop genuine understanding, then every emotional conversation may accidentally strengthen the same cycle you are trying to leave behind. Deciding not to return to that repeated pattern changes the entire balance of the relationship. It removes the opportunity for them to continue guiding your emotional responses through reactions, arguments, or emotional pressure. Without your constant engagement, they no longer receive the same certainty that your attention will always be available whenever they want it. The control they once assumed was permanent begins to feel uncertain, and the dynamic starts to shift in a way they did not expect. One of the most commonly misunderstood ideas in relationships involving narcissistic behaviors is the concept of emotional supply. Many people hear this phrase and think it only means receiving compliments, admiration, or praise. However, emotional supply can involve much more than positive attention. It can include any form of emotional energy that confirms their importance, their influence, or their ability to affect someone else. Compliments may provide this reinforcement, but so can arguments, emotional reactions, repeated forgiveness, constant attempts to prove your loyalty, and even seeing someone deeply hurt because of their actions. When your thoughts, feelings, and energy repeatedly focus on them, they continue to hold a central position in your inner world. That position can become reinforcing because it confirms that they still matter greatly and that the emotional connection remains active. During the relationship, you may have believed that your efforts to communicate better, explain your feelings, repair misunderstandings, or save the connection were simply expressions of love and commitment. You might have spent countless hours thinking about conversations, analyzing every word, writing long messages, or trying to help them understand your perspective. From your point of view, these actions represented care, patience, and the hope that things could improve. However, every emotional effort also showed that they still had access to your attention and emotional energy. Whether you were showing love, expressing frustration, sharing disappointment, or feeling overwhelmed, your focus remained directed toward them. This continued engagement could become a consistent source of validation, not necessarily because every interaction was positive, but because every interaction proved that they still occupied a significant place in your emotional life. This is one reason why conflicts in narcissistic relationships can sometimes continue for far longer than people expect. Many individuals believe arguments happen because two people genuinely want to solve a problem and reach a healthier understanding. In balanced relationships, that is often the case. But when unhealthy narcissistic patterns exist, conflict itself can sometimes become a method of keeping the connection alive. Every disagreement creates another opportunity for communication, another chance to defend themselves, redirect blame, change the focus, or pull you back into explaining your emotions again. As long as you remain emotionally invested and continue responding, the relationship continues receiving energy, even if that energy comes through frustration, sadness, confusion, or pain. When you completely stop reaching out, that emotional stream suddenly comes to an end. There are no longer long explanations for them to respond to, no visible reactions for them to analyze, no emotional messages waiting for their attention, and no repeated attempts from you to repair something that has already caused damage. This absence can feel incredibly different because a familiar source of attention has disappeared. Instead of receiving a constant flow of emotional involvement, they are met with silence. And silence gives them very little material to work with. There is no argument to challenge, no apology to accept or reject, and no clear evidence that they still hold the same emotional position in your life. Because of this, some narcissistic individuals may attempt to reconnect in ways that appear confusing or contradictory. They may suddenly become more gentle, offer unexpected apologies, bring up positive memories from the past, or send casual messages that appear innocent and harmless. Others may react differently by becoming critical, spreading negative comments, showing anger, or pretending that they are completely unaffected by your absence. These reactions may look completely different on the surface, but they can often represent attempts to understand whether they still have influence and whether the connection can still be restored in a way that benefits them. Although these reactions may appear completely different from each other at first glance, they often serve a very similar purpose: discovering whether the emotional connection can still be awakened. If you respond with intense emotion, whether that emotion is positive or negative, the old pattern can begin to form again. However, when there is no response at all, the emotional attention and validation they once relied on are no longer available in the way they previously expected. One of the most difficult experiences for someone with strong narcissistic tendencies is facing uncertainty. While uncertainty is something every person experiences throughout life, many individuals learn how to handle it by building trust, having honest communication, and accepting that they cannot control every situation or every person around them. A person with narcissistic traits may experience uncertainty in a much more challenging way. A significant part of their confidence can come from believing they understand how others will react to them. They often become used to predicting responses, noticing patterns in behavior, and feeling that they can shape the emotional direction of a relationship. When another person consistently reacts in familiar ways, that predictability can create a feeling of psychological comfort and control. They begin to recognize which words may create feelings of guilt, which actions might encourage forgiveness, and which behaviors can keep the relationship moving in a direction that serves their needs. Over time, these emotional patterns can become deeply established. If every conflict eventually ends with you being the person who reaches out first, they may start expecting that outcome. If every period of distance is eventually interrupted by your message, they begin to view that as a normal part of the relationship cycle. Even your emotional reactions, such as crying, becoming frustrated, explaining yourself repeatedly, or trying to make them understand your feelings, can become predictable responses. These reactions may reassure them that they still know how to affect your emotions and influence the situation. This sense of predictability can make them feel secure because they believe their actions will continue creating the reactions they are familiar with. The relationship can slowly begin to feel less like a balanced connection between two people and more like a system where they believe they already understand how everything will unfold. But everything shifts when you completely stop reaching out. Your silence creates something they cannot easily interpret. Suddenly, they no longer know what is happening inside your mind, what choices you have made, or whether you have emotionally moved forward. They cannot determine whether you still think about them, whether you have finally found inner peace, or whether another person has become meaningful in your life. Unlike a disagreement or an emotional conversation, silence gives them almost no information to analyze. It does not reveal your feelings, your intentions, or whether they still have the same emotional impact they once had. For someone who has depended on emotional patterns and predictable reactions, this lack of information can become extremely uncomfortable because they are no longer able to confidently predict what will happen next. This uncertainty may cause them to search for answers in indirect ways. They may look through your social media, ask shared friends about you, replay previous conversations, or create small reasons to start communication again. Sometimes these actions are not driven by true concern or curiosity, but by the desire to reduce the discomfort created by not knowing. Having information about your emotional state can restore their sense of control, while being unaware forces them to face a situation they cannot easily influence. Even if they never openly admit feeling disturbed, the inability to predict your actions can challenge the confidence they once had in their ability to guide the relationship. The reason silence can feel so powerful is because it removes the familiar script they had become dependent on. There is no argument for them to control, no explanation for them to reject, no apology they can use to shift responsibility, and no emotional reaction they can observe and measure. Instead, they are left with unanswered questions that cannot be solved through the same strategies that may have worked before. The certainty they once depended on begins to disappear because the person they thought they understood is no longer responding according to the same predictable pattern that gave them confidence. If this discussion is helping you recognize these emotional patterns from a different perspective, take a moment to subscribe and leave a comment with one word: freedom. That word is not about changing someone else's actions. It represents remembering your own strength, your own peace, and where your emotional energy truly belongs. Now let's continue. When someone stops initiating contact with a person who has narcissistic traits, it is possible that attempts to reconnect may happen afterward. Many people feel surprised by this because they assume that ending communication means the relationship has naturally ended for both individuals. However, when the usual exchange of attention, validation, and emotional involvement suddenly disappears, some people with narcissistic behaviors may attempt to restore that connection. These attempts can appear in many different ways, and understanding the psychological reasons behind them is often more valuable than focusing only on the specific actions themselves. The purpose is not always to rebuild a healthy and balanced relationship. In many situations, the deeper motivation may be to discover whether access, influence, or emotional availability is still present. One of the most common methods is sudden charm. A person who was once distant, uncaring, critical, or emotionally unavailable may suddenly appear warm, loving, and deeply attentive. They may behave in a way that feels completely different from how they acted before, creating confusion and making you question whether things have truly changed.